They gave me away on a Friday, not to a family, not to someone who wanted me, to a homeless man that nobody in town would make eye contact with. Torn jeans, no shoes, a gas station coffee cup he carried everywhere like it was the most valuable thing he owned. That was my husband. That was what 24 years of being nobody's child got me. I walked down that aisle in an $11 Goodwill dress. I had pressed every crease out of it the night before because it was the only thing I had any control over. I said I do in a clear, steady voice, and I sat down and I told myself what I had been telling myself since I was 4 years old. Pay attention. Watch everything. You will understand it when it is time. So 3 days later, a black Rolls Royce with a suited driver pulled up on Main Street, and every person in that town finally understood something. But none of them knew what I knew. None of them had been watching the right things. None of them had seen him leave that tip at the diner, exactly the right amount. Not $1 more, not $1 less. And that one detail had already told me everything. This is my story. It starts with nobody wanting me, and it ends with me running a foundation that has changed 400 lives. And every single person who looked away is still in that town. Before we go any further, we want to know where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, or Canada? Drop your location in the comments right now. We read every single one. Oh no, and if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let me take you all the way back to the beginning, because to understand everything that happened on that Friday afternoon, you need to understand who Rose Carter was before any of it started. You need to understand what 24 years of being invisible does to a person. And you need to understand why the people who thought they were giving her away were actually handing her exactly what she had been waiting for. Rose Ellen Carter was born on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 1998 in a small town called Grover's Hollow in rural Mississippi. Population 1,240, one gas station, one diner. My one Baptist church on Cedar Street that everyone attended on Sunday mornings, regardless of whether they believed in anything, because in Grover's Hollow Church was not about faith. It was about being seen, about being present, about demonstrating to the people around you that you belong to something. Rose's mother was 22 years old when she had her. Her name was Dorothy. She was a quiet woman who worked the early shift at the laundry on Route 9 and who had a specific way of humming to herself in the kitchen that Rose would spend the rest of her life trying to remember clearly and never quite being able to. Dorothy died 6 weeks before Rose's 5th birthday from a kidney infection that went untreated for too long because the family had no insurance and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. And by the time anyone understood how serious it was, the window for doing something about it had already closed. Rose was 4 years old and 351 days when her mother died. She was not quite old enough to understand death. She was old enough to understand absence. Her father's name was Thomas Carter, and he had been gone since Rose was 2 years old. Not dead, gone. He had driven away one morning in a green pickup truck, and he had not driven back. Rose had a single photograph of him, a Polaroid taken at a barbecue somewhere the summer before he left. He was laughing at something off camera. When he looked like a man who did not know he was about to become the kind of person who drives away and does not come back. Rose kept that photograph in a small envelope inside the cover of the Bible that had been her mother's. She did not look at it often, but she kept it, because it was the only proof she had that she had come from somewhere, that she had not simply appeared one rainy Tuesday morning in October with no origin and no story and no one. After Dorothy died, Rose was passed. That is the only word for it. Passed. From her maternal grandmother, who was 73 years old and unwell, and genuinely could not manage, to her mother's sister Carol, who lived in a 2-bedroom house in Tupelo, with her own 3 children and a husband who worked nights and a patience that ran out inside 3 months, to a woman named Mrs. So Patricia Odom, who attended the Baptist church on Cedar Street and who had a good heart in the specific limitation of a good-hearted person, which is that she believed intention was the same as action, and it is not. Mrs. Odom meant well. She did not have the capacity for what Rose needed, which was not grand gestures or church casseroles, but simply the daily unspectacular presence of a person who was glad she was there. Rose spent 2 years with Mrs. Odom, And then Mrs. Odom's health declined and Rose was passed again. To a cousin of her father's named Mr. Gerald, who lived in a trailer on the east side of town, and who was not unkind but who was also not present in any meaningful sense. He worked 6 days a week at a chicken processing plant 40 minutes outside of town, and when he came home in the evenings, he sat in front of the television and he was done. Rose was 11 years old and she learned in those 8 months with Mr. Gerald how to cook a simple dinner and how to do her own laundry and how to get herself to school and back without anyone showing her the route. She learned these things not because Mr. Gerald taught her, but because they needed to be done, and she was the one present to do them. She did not resent this. She filed it, added it to the accumulation of skills and observations and patient understandings that she was building in the absence of anything else to build. After Mr. Gerald, she went to a family friend of the cousin, a woman named Mrs. Paulette, who had 2 grown children of her own and a house that smelled of lavender and furniture polish, and who was the first person in Rose's life who sat across from her at dinner and asked her about school with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Rose was 12 years old and she was careful at first. She had learned to be careful about warmth from adults because warmth from adults in her experience had a shelf life that was never as long as it appeared at the beginning. Mrs. Paulette's warmth lasted 14 months before her younger daughter asked her to come and help with a new baby in Houston, and the practical reality of that request was that there was no longer room in Mrs. Paulette's life for a 12-year-old girl from Grover's Hollow. She was sorry about it. She told Rose she was sorry about it. Rose said it was all right. She meant it, not because it did not hurt, it did hurt, but because she had already learned that hurt was information and information was useful, and she was going to use it. She went to her Aunt Brenda, who was her mother's youngest sister, and who lived in a small house on the edge of Grover's Hollow, and who would become the last stop on Rose's journey through other people's lives before the Friday that changed everything. Rose was 13 years old when she arrived at Aunt Brenda's house. She had a backpack with 4 changes of clothes and her mother's Bible and the Polaroid photograph, and a quality that nobody who passed her from house to house ever bothered to look for. She was patient in a way that 13-year-old children almost never are, not the passive patience of a child who has given up. The active patience of a child who is gathering information, who is watching and filing and waiting for the moment when what she has gathered will become useful. She had developed this quality without knowing she was developing it. It had grown in her the way things grow in the absence of attention, quietly, in the dark, without anyone noticing until it was fully formed. Aunt Brenda was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one. There is a difference, and the difference matters when you are a child living in someone else's house. A cruel person does damage on purpose. A practical person does damage without noticing because they are too focused on what is in front of them to see what is beside them. Brenda had her own life, her own problems, her own specific set of worries that occupied most of her available attention most of the time. Rose was an additional item on a list that was already long. She was fed and housed, and her clothes were clean, and her school fees were paid, and those were the requirements that Brenda understood and met consistently. The other requirements, the ones that did not have a practical answer, the need to be seen, the need to be chosen, the need to have someone look at you across a room and be glad you were there. Those requirements went unmet. Not because Brenda was hard, because she was practical. And practically speaking, those needs did not appear on any list she knew how to read. Rose understood this by the time she was 15 years old. She had understood it about every house she had lived in before Brenda's too. She did not blame any of them. That was the remarkable thing about Rose that nobody around her ever took the time to notice. She did not carry bitterness. She had decided at some point in the years between 4 and 15 that bitterness was a weight she could not afford to carry and still move forward, and she intended to move forward. She did not know yet what forward looked like. She just knew that it existed, that somewhere ahead of Grover's Hollow and Aunt Brenda's house and the backpack with 4 changes of clothes, there was a version of her life that belonged to her. She was going to find it. She was going to find it by paying attention. She was large from early childhood, heavy in the way that some bodies simply are, not from overeating, not from any cause that the people around her tried to identify and correct with unsolicited advice, which they did regularly. simply the way her body was built. She was 5 feet 4 inches and heavy and round-faced, and she moved through the world in a body that people in Grover's Hollow had decided opinions about and shared those opinions freely and publicly in the specific way that small communities in rural America have of discussing bodies that do not match their preferred dimensions. She heard it from the time she was old enough to understand language. The comments in grocery store aisles, the looks in church pews, the specific kind of laughter that stops just before you enter a room and hangs in the air after you arrive. She heard all of it. She absorbed none of it. She filed it under information about the people speaking rather than information about herself. That distinction was one of the most important things Rose Carter ever did for herself. She decided very early that what people said about her body told her about them, not about her, and she proceeded accordingly. She was exceptional at school, not in the way that gets noticed in small towns, which is loudly and publicly, and with the kind of obvious brilliance that teachers can point to in parent-teacher conferences. In the quiet way. The way that is easy to overlook if you are not paying attention. She finished at the top of her class in mathematics and English every single year from 5th grade through 12th grade. She read everything available to her, the school library, the public library on Tuesdays when she could get there. Whatever Brenda had on the shelves at home, she read the way some people pray, with focus and regularity, and the sense that what she was doing was building something essential inside her that the outside world could not touch. She did not win awards. She was not invited to academic competitions. She was not encouraged by any adult to consider what came after high school. There was one teacher in her junior year who had noticed her grade in mathematics and had asked to speak to her after class one afternoon. He had said that she had a remarkable mind and that she should consider applying to the state university on a merit scholarship. Rose had gone home that evening and researched the application process and the scholarship requirements and the deadlines. She had sat at Brenda's kitchen table with the information in front of her, and she had understood very clearly that the application required a sponsor. Honey, an adult who could vouch for her circumstances and advocate for her case. She had looked around at the available adults in her life, and she had made an honest assessment of what each of them was able to provide. She had put the information away. She had gone back to her room. She had picked up her mathematics textbook, and she had kept reading because the reading was something she could do regardless of what the applications required. She graduated in the spring of 2016. She went home to Brenda's house and she got a job at the diner on Main Street, and she saved every dollar she could and she waited. She was 24 years old and she had been waiting her whole life. She was patient. She was watching. She was paying attention. The diner was called Clara's after the woman who had opened it in 1987 and who still came in every Tuesday morning to check on things, even though her daughter Margaret ran it day to day now. It seated 32 people when full. It was rarely full except on Sunday mornings after church, when the whole town descended at once and every table was taken, and the coffee ran low and the staff moved fast, and the noise level made conversation difficult, which suited most people just fine. Because in Grover's Hollow, the Sunday morning diner visit was not about conversation. It was about being seen. Rose had been working at Clara's for 4 years by the time Marcus appeared. She knew every regular customer by name and by order. She knew that Mr. Henderson took his coffee black with 2 sugars and that Mrs. Nay Beaumont could not have dairy, and that the Patterson brothers who came in every Saturday morning always left $1.50 between them for a tip on a $14 bill, and that this was not going to change regardless of how good the service was, because the Patterson brothers had decided a long time ago what things were worth, and they were not going to be persuaded otherwise by anything as minor as effort or attention. She knew that the elderly woman who came in alone every Wednesday and sat in the booth by the window and ordered the soup, and the half sandwich was named Mrs. Green, and that she had been coming to that booth every Wednesday since her husband died 7 years ago, because Wednesday had been their day. Rose always made sure Mrs. Green soup was the right temperature, and her half sandwich was cut on the diagonal the way she liked it, and she always found a minute to stop at that booth and ask how the week was going. Not because she was required to, because Mrs. Green deserved a minute of genuine attention on a Wednesday, and Rose was in a position to provide it. Rose treated every table the same. This was not a performance. It was not something she had been trained to do. It was simply who she was. The tables that tipped well and the tables that did not receive the same quality of attention. The customers who said please and thank you, and the customers who did not got the same warm professional service. The people who made comments about her size when they thought she was out of earshot, and the people who did not got the same smile when she brought their food. While she was not doing this to demonstrate anything, she was not waiting for recognition. She was simply the same in every situation because she had decided a long time ago that the version of herself that changed depending on who was watching was not a version she was interested in being. She had one version. It was consistent. It was entirely her own. She noticed Marcus the first Thursday evening he came in. She noticed him the way she noticed everything, not with dramatic recognition, with the specific attention of a woman who was always gathering data, whether she chose to or not. He took the corner table. He ordered coffee and the blue plate special. He read his newspaper. He ate without hurry. He left a tip. Rose was clearing a table across the room when he placed the bills on the table. She clocked the amount from across the room without intending to and filed it without thinking about it. Correct, not generous, not reluctant. Correct. She went back to her work. She did not think about him again that evening. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and every Thursday after that for 6 weeks. Same table, same order, same newspaper, same tip, always exactly correct. Rose served him 4 of those Thursday evenings. Their exchanges were brief and professional. He said what he needed. She brought what he ordered. He said thank you. She said of course. That was the full extent of it. But Rose was building a picture the way she always built pictures, quietly and from multiple data points. She noticed the new shoes he had on the Wednesday they passed each other on Main Street. She noticed the way he held doors for people coming behind him without looking to see if anyone was watching. She noticed the way he spoke to Mrs. Tatum at the boarding house front desk, always by name, always with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the person he was speaking to deserved to be spoken to properly, regardless of what they were wearing or where they were standing in the visible hierarchy of things. She noticed the way he interacted with the children who sometimes played on the steps of the hardware store where he sat in the mornings. He did not talk down to them. He did not ignore them. He answered their questions directly and with the full weight of his attention, as if a 7-year-old asking why the sky was blue deserved the same quality of response as anyone else. Rose noticed this from across the street on a Tuesday morning when she was walking to her shift, and she filed it with everything else she had filed about this man, and she thought about the tip, and she thought about the shoes, and she thought about the way he said Mrs. Tatum by name, and she thought about the children on the steps, and she thought, I do not know yet what you are, but I know what you are not. She went to work. She said nothing to anyone. She waited. Marcus James Webb had been doing this for 4 years when he arrived in Grover's Hollow. He had started in a town in rural Georgia. He had spent 6 weeks there, and he had watched and he had found what he always found in those first towns before he understood fully what he was looking for. He had found people who were kind when kindness was easy and cold when it was not required. He had found the specific calibration of a community that had decided its hierarchies and was not interested in revising them. He had found a woman in the third town who fed the same hungry man at her back door every morning for 6 weeks without telling her husband, because her husband would have said they could not afford it and she could not afford not to. He had found a boy in the fifth town who had walked 3 miles in the rain to return a wallet he had found on the road. The wallet had contained $40 and the boy's family had very little. He had kept not $1 of it. He had found these things and they had moved him, and they had told him something important about the specific quality he was looking for, but they had not been quite what his grandmother's letter had described. Not quite. There was always something. Why, a moment where the kindness had an audience, a moment where the honesty was performed for someone watching. He was looking for something so consistent and so unconditional that it happened even when nobody was looking, even when there was no possible benefit to the person doing it, even when the world had given that person every reason to stop extending grace to anyone. He had been looking for that for 4 years. He had come close in the 11th town. He had come close in the 14th. He had left both of them without staying because close was not what the letter had described. The letter had described something exact, and he was not going to settle for approximate. He came to Grover's Hollow because of something his research director had found in a data analysis of small communities across the American South. A pattern of informal mutual aid in a specific zip code that was statistically unusual for a community of that size and economic profile. Not organized charity, not church programs. Individual people in a low-income community quietly helping each other in ways that were not recorded or rewarded or even acknowledged. His research director had flagged it as an anomaly. Marcus had said, "Book me a bus ticket." He had arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, and he had sat on the steps of the hardware store, and he had started watching. For the first 2 weeks, he watched the town generally, how people moved, how they spoke to each other, who helped whom and under what conditions. In the third week, he started watching Rose, not because she had done anything dramatic, because she had done something small. He had been sitting on the steps on a Wednesday morning when Rose had walked past on her way to her shift at the diner. An elderly man ahead of her had dropped his bag of groceries on the sidewalk. The bag had split. Oranges and cans and a box of cereal had rolled across the pavement. Rose had been already running slightly late for work. He could tell by the pace she was walking. She had stopped. She had crouched down on the sidewalk in her diner uniform, and she had gathered every item, and she had helped the man repack them into her own reusable bag, which she had then given him to keep. The man had thanked her. She had said, of course. She had continued to work. The whole thing had taken 4 minutes. She had not looked around to see if anyone had noticed. She had simply done it and moved on. Hannah Marcus had watched the whole thing from across the street. He had filed it. He had started watching more carefully. It was at the church social on the second Saturday in October that the conversation about Rose started. It started the way things start in small towns, with one person saying something practical to another person, and that person agreeing, and the next thing anyone knew, it had become a decision that nobody could precisely remember making. Rose's aunt was leaving. Rose needed somewhere to go. Marcus needed something. Nobody was quite sure what he needed, but the arrangement seemed practical, and practical was the language that Rose's life had always been conducted in. Rose was told on a Tuesday evening. Her aunt sat her down at the kitchen table and explained it the way you explain something to a person you have already decided does not get a vote. She said Marcus Webb had agreed to take Rose as his wife. She said it was a sensible arrangement. She said it solved a problem. Rose sat at that kitchen table and she looked at her aunt and she thought about the tip at the diner. Exactly the right amount. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." Her aunt looked at her. She had been expecting tears. She had been expecting resistance. Rose went to her room to pack. She was not afraid. She was paying very close attention. Rose found the dress at the Goodwill on Highway 49 on Wednesday afternoon. $11. White cotton with a fitted bodice that was tight across her shoulders, but hung cleanly from the waist. Where the hem was slightly uneven on the right side. She bought it. She brought it home. She spent 2 hours that night pressing it with the iron Brenda kept in the hall closet. Slow and careful. Every panel. Every seam. She turned it on the ironing board, and she worked on it with the same focused patience she brought to everything. And by the time she was done, it looked like a dress that had cost considerably more than $11. She hung it on the back of her door, and she turned off the light, and she lay down on her bed in the dark, and she thought about the next morning. She did not pray. She had made her peace with God a long time ago, but prayer felt to her like asking for things, and she had learned not to ask for things. She thought instead. She thought about the tip. She thought about the hands. She thought about the shoes he would buy because the occasion deserved it. She did not know yet that he had bought shoes, but she thought he might have. She thought that was the kind of man who would buy shoes for a wedding, even when nobody was requiring it of him. She closed her eyes. She went to sleep. The wedding was on a Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock at the Baptist Church on Cedar Street. 14 people in the pews. Marcus stood at the altar in his worn jeans and his carefully repaired jacket, and he had combed his hair. Rose walked down the aisle alone in her $11 pressed dress with her chin level and her eyes on the man at the altar. She noticed as she walked toward him that his shoes were new, not expensive, but new, clean. He had bought new shoes for the wedding. Nobody else noticed this. Rose noticed. She filed it. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. Marcus said, "I do," in a quiet, steady voice. Rose said I do in a clear, steady voice. The ceremony was over. They walked to the boarding house together, not holding hands, walking side by side. He opened the boarding house door for her. He handed her a room key. He said goodnight. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the single bed and she thought about the shoes. He had bought new shoes because the occasion required it. Because the person he was marrying deserved a man in new shoes, even if the people arranging the marriage had decided she was worth $11 and 14 curious witnesses. She closed her eyes. She went to sleep. 3 days of ordinary life followed. Marcus knocked on her door each morning at 7. They ate breakfast. He read the newspaper. She drank her coffee and watched the street. In the evenings, they sometimes sat on the small porch together in the quiet that was comfortable between them from the very beginning. The porch had 2 chairs and a view of the main road, and in the evenings, the light changed over Grover's Hollow in the slow amber way. That light changes over Mississippi towns in the fall, and it was not an unpleasant thing to sit and watch. Rose observed everything about those 3 days with the same completeness she observed everything. The way he ate, unhurried, without the self-consciousness of a man who was aware of being watched. The way he read, cover to cover, every section, not skimming, reading. The way he treated every person he encountered, the woman who brought their breakfast, the man who swept the boarding house steps in the mornings, were the children from the house across the road who sometimes shouted questions at him from the other side of the fence, and to whom he always responded directly and without condescension. She built the picture piece by piece the way she always built pictures. And by the 3rd evening, she had enough pieces to ask the question. She said, "Marcus, why are you here?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I will answer that tomorrow morning." She nodded. She went inside. She was ready. At 6:45 the following morning, a sound woke her. An engine. Not a truck. Not a pickup. Something with a quality of complete restraint. The sound of something powerful that was not trying to show you it was powerful. She went to the window. The car was black. Not painted black. Built black. Tinted windows. A driver in a dark suit beside the rear door. 2 more men in suits at either end of the vehicle. All of them completely still and professional and entirely out of place on Main Street in Grover's Hollow on a Thursday morning in October. Rose stood at the window with both hands on the sill, and she looked at the car for a long time. She was not shocked. She nodded slowly to herself. Then she got dressed and went downstairs. Marcus was at the small table near the window. Dark trousers, white shirt she had not seen before. No newspaper. He looked up when she came down the stairs. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She sat across from him. He put his coffee cup down. He said, "I promised you an answer." She said, "Yes." He said, "Where would you like me to start?" She said, "The beginning." He said, "All right." And then he told her everything. His full name was Marcus James Webb, and he was 32 years old. He was the founder and chief executive of Webb Capital Group, a private equity firm headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, with offices in New York, Chicago, and Houston. The firm managed $11.4 billion in assets. He had started it at 19 years old with $40,000 his grandmother had left him. He had built every dollar of what it had become from that $40,000 through 14 years of work. He was worth $3.8 billion personally. He had a home in Buckhead, Atlanta, an apartment in Manhattan. He had a driver named Joseph who was currently standing beside a 2023 Rolls Royce Ghost on Main Street waiting. 4 years ago, he had started doing something that everyone close to him had told him was unnecessary. He had started arriving in small towns across the American South as a man with nothing. A worn jacket, torn jeans. He would arrive on a Tuesday and spend 6 weeks watching people. Not the markets, not the opportunities, the people. He was looking for something specific, something his grandmother had described in a letter she had left him when she died. The way a person treats people who can do nothing for them. He had been looking for it for 4 years across 16 towns. He had found it in Rose. He told her what he had watched, the meals she had given away, the furniture she had helped move, the groceries she had helped the old man pick up from the sidewalk on a Wednesday morning when she was running late for work, the way she had treated every table at the diner the same, and the way she had responded to unkindness about her size with nothing but dignity. The monthly notes she had sent to Mrs. Green's daughter in Birmingham when Mrs. Green was in hospital. He had watched all of it, every piece. He said in the 16 towns he had not found what he was looking for. He said by the time of the wedding he was already certain. He said, I married you because I had decided and I wanted to give you a choice. He said, if you had said no at that altar, I would have accepted it and left, and you would never have seen me again. He said, you said yes. She said, I said yes because I had nothing to lose. He said, I know. He said, that is part of what I was watching. He said, the way a person behaves when they have nothing to lose tells you more about them than anything else. He said you behaved with more dignity when you had nothing to lose than most people manage when they have everything to protect. He said that is rare. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you tipped exactly the right amount at the diner. He looked at her. She said, that was the first thing I noticed about you. He said, how did that tell you anything? She said, a man with nothing does not know what the right amount is. He knows what he can afford. Those are different calculations. You are making the right calculation, not the what can I afford calculation. He looked at her for a long time. He said, in 4 years and 17 towns, nobody noticed that. She said, most people are not paying attention. He said, no. He said, they are not. He said, you are. She said, I have always paid attention. It was the only thing I had. They stayed in Grover's Hollow for 3 more days after that morning. On the last day, Marcus said he wanted to do one thing before they left. He said he wanted the town to see her in the car. She said, that is not necessary. He said, I know. He said, I want to do it anyway. She said, all right. They walked out of the boarding house together and Joseph opened the rear door and Rose got in and Marcus got in beside her and they drove slowly down Main Street with the windows down on her side. She did not perform anything. She did not wave. She did not look triumphant. She simply looked out the window at the town that had passed her from house to house and arranged her marriage with the casual ease of people solving a minor inconvenience. She looked at all of it with the same expression she had worn her entire life. Patient, clear, paying attention. At the end of Main Street, Joseph turned onto Highway 49 heading north toward the interstate, and Grover's Hollow disappeared behind them, and Rose did not look back once. The drive to Atlanta took 6 hours. Marcus worked on his laptop for most of it. Rose looked out the window at Mississippi, and then Alabama, and then Georgia, and she thought about Dorothy, her mother, and what Dorothy would have made of a black Rolls Royce on a Thursday afternoon, and the thought made her smile quietly. The Buckhead house was the largest building she had ever been inside that was not a school or a public building. She stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceiling and was quiet for a moment. Marcus stood beside her and said nothing. He was already learning that her silences were processing, not discomfort. When she was ready, she said, I will need to learn where things are. He said, of course. She said, I will not need long. He said, I know. The house manager, Catherine, showed her through every room. Rose asked precise questions and remembered every answer. She was not overwhelmed. She was not performing ease she did not feel. She was simply doing what she had always done, understanding every new environment completely before she moved through it with confidence. The first weeks in Atlanta were the steepest learning curve of Rose's life, and she approached them the same way she had approached every difficult thing. By paying attention. Marcus had a world, and that world had specific languages and rules and ways of conducting itself that Rose did not yet know. Business dinners where the conversation was partly about the food and mostly about something else entirely. Events where people perform versions of themselves for audiences of other people who were also performing. Meetings where the real substance happened in the 10 minutes before the official meeting began. Rose watched all of it. She asked questions when she did not understand something, and she remembered every answer without writing anything down. She made 2 mistakes in the first month. The first was at a board dinner in October when she asked a direct question about a financial decision that Marcus's senior partners were dancing around rather than addressing. The question was the right question. The timing was the wrong timing. She understood this from the way the room went quiet for a moment and then moved forward. She noted it. She did not make that mistake again. The second mistake was smaller, a social occasion where she had been more direct with a business contact's wife than the occasion required. The woman had said something Rose disagreed with, and Rose had said so clearly, and the woman had been surprised in a way that was visible. Marcus had explained the social architecture of that particular room to her that evening. Rose had listened and had understood and had asked 2 follow-up questions that demonstrated she had not just heard the explanation, but had understood the underlying principle. He had looked at her across the kitchen table after those 2 questions, and he had said, "You know, you are remarkable." She had said, "I am just paying attention." He had laughed. It was the beginning of him understanding that with Rose, those 2 things were the same. By the 3rd month, she had begun to understand not just the rules, but the reasons behind the rules, which is a different and more useful kind of knowledge. By the 6th month, the people in Marcus's world, who had initially not known what to make of her, had begun to understand what they were looking at. A woman whose quality of attention was so complete and so consistent that being in a room with her made you feel that what you were saying mattered, that it was being genuinely heard and genuinely considered. Marcus's chief investment officer said to him after a strategy meeting in November that Rose had asked one question in that meeting that had reframed the entire conversation. He said she asked it like it was obvious. Marcus said to him it probably was obvious to her. The chief investment officer said that was his point. Marcus's board noticed it first, then his senior partners, then the people who had known Marcus the longest and trusted his judgment the most. They noticed that when Rose Carter was in the room, the quality of every conversation in that room was better. Not because she dominated it, because she was fully present in it. There is a difference. Rose had always understood that difference. Marcus told her the full story on a Tuesday evening, 6 months after Atlanta. They were in the living room of the Buckhead house after dinner. He told her about his grandmother, Dorothy Webb, born in rural Alabama in 1942. Large and poor, and without prospects in a time and a place that had specific ideas about what large poor women without prospects were worth. Arranged into a marriage at 22, built a life that nobody expected from the materials she was given. Raised Marcus's father to be the kind of man who raised Marcus to be the kind of man who sat on steps in 17 towns looking for the quality his grandmother had described. She had died when Marcus was 19 and left him $40,000 in a letter. The letter said, "Find someone who treats people the same way, regardless of what those people can do for them." It said that quality is rarer than money and more valuable than anything a person can own. It said, "Build with someone who has it. Everything else follows." Rose sat in the living room and listened to all of this until the end. When he finished, she said, "What was her name?" He said, "Dorothy." Rose said, "My mother's name was Dorothy." He looked at her. She looked at him. The room was quiet for a long time. Neither of them needed to say anything else. Some things are simply true, and the truth of them does not require elaboration. The foundation's first year was not what Rose had imagined it would be. She had imagined it would be straightforward. Find the young women, provide the funding, show them the doors. What she had not imagined was the weight of it, not the administrative weight, not the financial weight, the emotional weight of sitting across from a young woman who had been told her whole life that she was not worth much and trying to give her in one conversation what nobody had given her in 18 years. Rose understood very quickly that funding and mentorship were necessary, but they were not sufficient. What these young women needed before anything else was to be believed in by someone who had no practical reason to believe in them, someone who was not being paid to sit across that table, someone who chose to be there. That was the hardest part to build, not the office, not the programs, the choosing, making sure every single person who worked for the foundation understood that what they were doing was not a job in the conventional sense. It was a decision they made every morning when they walked through the door. The decision to see the person in front of them clearly and completely and without the filter of everything that person had been told they were. Rose hired 12 people in the first year. She interviewed every one of them herself. She did not ask them about their qualifications first. She asked them one question before anything else. She said, "Tell me about a time someone saw something in you that you did not yet see in yourself." If they could answer that question with specific detail and genuine feelings, she kept talking to them. If they could not, she thanked them for their time and wished them well. Her chief of staff asked her once why she used that question. She said, "Because the people who have been seen clearly understand what it means to see someone else clearly." She said, "I need people in this building who know what that feels like from the inside." Her chief of staff said, "What if someone has a perfect resume but cannot answer the question?" Rose said then, "They are not right for this work." He said, "You might miss exceptional people." She said, "I might." She said, I will not miss the right people. She had not missed one yet. By the end of the first year, the foundation had helped 63 young women. Not all of them had gone to university. Not all of them had taken the conventional path that funding and mentorship are usually designed to support. Some of them had used the foundation's resources to start small businesses. One had used it to get her commercial driving license and had started a logistics company that by the third year employed 8 people. One had used it to fund a cosmetology certification and had opened a salon in her hometown that had become, in the 2 years since its opening, the kind of place people drove 40 minutes to get to. Rose tracked all of them, not as data points, as people. She remembered their specific stories the way she had always remembered everything, with complete and permanent attention. On the last Friday of every month, she wrote personal notes to every woman the foundation had ever helped. Not emails, handwritten notes on heavy cream paper with the foundation letterhead, each one specific, each one referencing something particular about that person's journey, not a template, not a form letter. A note that told the recipient that someone knew their name and their story and was paying attention to where they were going. Several of the women had told Rose that the monthly note was the thing they kept, that when things were hard, they went back to the notes, that having evidence in their hands that someone was watching and was proud of them was the thing that held them on the days when nothing else did. Rose understood this completely. She had spent 24 years with no one writing her notes. She was not going to let that be someone else's story if she could help it. The second year of the foundation was when Rose understood that what she had started was going to outlast her plans for it. The applications that came in that second year were not just from Mississippi and Alabama and the surrounding states she had initially focused on. They came from Georgia, in Tennessee and Arkansas, and then from states further north, from Ohio, from Michigan, from communities in rural Pennsylvania and West Virginia that looked different on the surface from Grover's Hollow, but were the same in the ways that mattered. Communities where certain people had been decided about, where the circle closed around itself and left specific people outside. One where a large, quiet girl with a good mind and nowhere to put it could spend 24 years being invisible. Rose read every application herself, every single one. Her board told her in the second year that she would need to delegate that process. She said, I will delegate everything else. She said, I will not delegate the reading of applications. She said, these are people who have sat down and trusted us with their story. She said, the least I can do is read it. Her board accepted this. They had learned by then that there were certain things Rose had decided, and those things were not going to change. The first time Marcus saw Rose cry was 7 months after Atlanta. And it was a Tuesday evening, and she had come home from the foundation office later than usual, and she had been quiet through dinner in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was full. This quiet was empty. He said nothing during dinner. He was learning her. He was still learning her. After dinner, she sat in the chair by the window that had become her chair, in the way that certain chairs in certain rooms become specific to certain people through the accumulation of habitual presence. She sat in that chair and she looked out at the Atlanta night, and after a long while she said, I had a girl today who was 16 years old. She said she had been in 11 foster homes. She said she had a grade point average of 3.8. She said nobody had ever told her it was remarkable. Not one person in 16 years had looked at a 3.8 grade point average produced in the circumstances that girl had produced it in and said that is remarkable, that you are remarkable. Rose sat in her chair, and the tears came in the quiet way they had always come when they came at all, not with sound, just present on her face in the warm lamplight of the Atlanta living room. Marcus sat across from her, and he did not say anything for a while. He understood that there was nothing to say. There was only the being present. Eventually he said, what is her name? Rose said her name is Amara. He said, is she coming to the foundation? Rose said yes. She said, I called her foster mother tonight. She said Amara is coming in on Thursday. She wiped her face. She said no one ever told her. He said, you are going to tell her. Rose said yes. She said, I'm going to tell her. She looked back out at the Atlanta night. The quiet between them was full again, the right kind of quiet. Amara came on the Thursday. She sat across from Rose in the foundation office on the 14th floor, and she was 17 years old, and she was wearing a school uniform that was slightly too small because nobody had noticed she had grown, and she had her hands in her lap and she was looking at the table between them with the specific expression of a young person who has learned not to expect much from rooms like this one. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Amara, I want to tell you something before we talk about anything practical." She said, "I have read your file. She said, I have read your grades and your teacher's comments and your test scores and your application essay. She said, I want you to understand something clearly. She said, what you have produced in the circumstances you have been in is not just good. She said, it is extraordinary. She said, I need you to hear that word. She said, extraordinary. Not good enough. Not impressive for your situation. Extraordinary. Full stop. No qualification." Amara looked up from the table. She looked at Rose. Rose held her gaze. She did not look away. She did not soften it with a smile or deflect it with practical next steps. She just let the words sit there between them and be true. Amara's eyes filled. She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. But something in her face changed. Something that had been braced against impact relaxed very slightly. The specific relaxation of a person who has been waiting for something to hit them and has just understood that what arrived instead was something completely different. Rose said, "Now let us talk about what comes next." And they did. The first time Rose saw Marcus doubt himself was in the third year. He had made a significant investment decision that had not gone the way the data had suggested it would, and he had lost the firm a considerable amount, not a ruinous amount. The firm was large enough to absorb it, but significant. He came home that evening with the specific quality of a man who has been sitting with something all day and has not been able to set it down. Rose was in the kitchen. She looked at him when he came through the door and she said, "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. She made tea. She put it in front of him and she sat across from him and she said, "Tell me." He told her the full details of the investment and where his reasoning had deviated from what the outcome turned out to require and what the cost had been. He was precise about it. He was honest about it. He was not catastrophizing. He was simply sitting clearly with a mistake he had made and the weight of what it had cost. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what I noticed the first week I was in Atlanta?" He looked at her. She said, "I noticed that you never made a decision in a meeting that you had not already considered fully before the meeting began." She said, "I noticed that you were always the best prepared person in every room." She said, "I noticed that the people who worked for you trusted your judgment not because of your title, but because your judgment had earned the trust over a long time." She said, "One decision does not change what you have built." He looked at her. He said, "How do you always know what to say?" She said, "I pay attention." She said, "I have been paying attention to you for 3 years." She said, "I know what you are." She said, "This is not what you are. This is something that happened." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his tea. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Of course." They sat together in the kitchen of the Buckhead house and drank their tea. And outside the window, Atlanta moved through its evening. And inside the room, two people who had found each other by watching carefully continued watching each other carefully and building something real from what they saw. Aunt Brenda called Rose 8 months after the Rolls Royce left Main Street. Rose was in her foundation office when the call came through. She looked at the number on her phone for a long moment before she answered. Brenda's voice was different on the phone from how Rose remembered it. Smaller, more careful. She said, "Rose, I wanted to call and say that I was glad you were doing well." She said, "I have seen things in the news about the foundation." She said, "It looks like important work." Rose said, "Thank you, Brenda." There was a silence. Then Brenda said, "I want to say that I am sorry for how things were arranged." She said, "You deserve to be asked." Rose sat in her office with the Atlanta skyline visible through the 14th floor window, and she thought about the kitchen table where Brenda had delivered the news without asking. She thought about the $11 dress and the iron and the boarding house mattress and the shoes Marcus had bought because the occasion deserved it. She said, "Brenda, I want to tell you something." She said, "I am not angry." She said, "I have not been angry for a long time." She said, "What happened led me exactly where I was supposed to go." She said, "I want you to understand that I mean that completely." Brenda was quiet for a moment. She said, "You are a good woman, Rose." Rose said, "I learned from good women." She said, "My mother was a good woman." Brenda said, "Yes." She said, "Dorothy was the best of us." They talked for another 20 minutes, not about the arrangement or the Rolls Royce or any of it, about Dorothy, about the way she hummed in the kitchen, about the specific quality of her laugh, about the woman she had been and the daughter she had raised, and the things she had left behind that were still present in the world, in the specific form of Rose Ellen Carter Webb, sitting in a foundation office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta, watching 400 young women find their way toward the lives that were waiting for them. When they said goodbye, Brenda said, "Call me sometime." Rose said, "I will." She meant it. She always meant what she said. That was one of the things that had never changed. Rose Webb is 26 years old today, and she runs the Dorothy Webb Foundation from an office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta with a view of the city that on clear days reaches all the way to the horizon. The foundation works in rural communities across the American South: Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee. It identifies young women in exactly the circumstances Rose grew up in, and it provides them with education funding and mentorship and a specific kind of attention that is the rarest and most valuable thing Rose knows how to give. The attention of someone who sees you clearly, who looks at you and finds something worth choosing. The foundation has helped 412 young women since it opened 3 years ago. Rose reads every case file personally. She knows every name. On the wall of her office, there is a single frame photograph, not the Rolls Royce, not the foundation launch, not the awards that have arrived in the 3 years since the foundation opened, the Polaroid from the barbecue, her father laughing at something off camera. She had it framed because it reminded her that everyone comes from somewhere, that even the people who leave are part of the story, that the story does not stop being yours just because someone chose not to stay in it. She is not angry at Thomas Carter. She had stopped being angry at him somewhere on Highway 49 between Grover's Hollow and Atlanta on a Thursday afternoon in October in the back of a black car. She understood somewhere in that drive that the people who left were not the story. The people who stayed were the story. Out of Dorothy, her mother, who worked the early shift at the laundry on Route 9 and hummed to herself in the kitchen. Dorothy, his grandmother, who wrote 4 pages to a 19-year-old boy about what mattered most in a life. Rose herself, who pressed an $11 dress for 2 hours at 11 o'clock at night because the occasion deserved it. The people who stayed. That was always the story. Marcus still goes to small towns sometimes, not looking for anyone, just to sit and drink coffee and watch the world at the speed it actually moves. Rose goes with him now. They sit on steps together in quiet towns and drink their coffee, and they are quiet in the way they have always been quiet together since the porch of the boarding house in Grover's Hollow. So the easy quiet of 2 people who found each other by paying attention and have not stopped paying attention since. He told her once that he was sorry for how it had started, for the arrangement and the altar and the $11 dress and the way a town had decided what she was worth without asking her. She said, "Do not be sorry." She said, "I had nothing to lose." She said, "That is the best position to make a clear decision from." She said, "I saw you clearly from the very beginning." She said, "I just waited for you to show me what I was seeing." He said, "What did you see?" She said, "I saw someone who tipped exactly the right amount." She said, "That had told me everything I needed to know." He laughed. He had the full laugh of a man who built $11 billion from 40,000 and still cannot quite believe that what finally found him was a woman watching from across a diner floor in rural Mississippi who noticed a tip. She smiled. Outside the window of wherever they happened to be, the world moved on at its usual speed. And Rose Webb, who had been given away by everyone who ever had her, sat in whatever chair she was sitting in, and she was exactly and completely and permanently at home in herself. She had always been at home in herself. She had just been waiting for the world to catch up to what she already knew. They gave her away on a Friday, and she let them, because she had already understood something none of them had. Being given away is only a loss if you believe you have no say in what comes next. Poor Rose had always believed she had a say in what comes next. That belief was the one thing nobody had ever managed to take from her. Not the houses, not the town, not the years of being invisible, not the church pews and the grocery store comments, and the 14 people who came to her wedding out of curiosity rather than love. Not any of it. She had always believed the next chapter was hers to write, and she had been right. She had always been right. She was just patient enough to wait until the evidence arrived. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. Is there someone in your life right now that you have been looking at without truly seeing? Someone you pass every day who is paying attention to everything while you look right past them. Think about that. Drop your answer in the comments below. And tell us where you are watching from tonight. United States, United Kingdom, Canada. Like this video and subscribe and turn on your notification bell. Because next week, I am going to tell you about a poor woman who showed up alone at a billionaire's mother's funeral. She had never met him once in her life. She simply thought no one should be buried without someone standing at their grave. What happened when he found out who she was is coming next week. Do not miss it.